Technology should be there to support the teacher, and I think assessment is this perfect place for it.
Welcome to Schools In, your go-to podcast for cutting-edge insights in learning. From early education to lifelong development, we dive into trends, innovations, and challenges facing learners of all ages. I'm Denise Pope, Senior Lecturer at Stanford's Graduate School of Education and co-founder of Challenge Success.
And I'm Dan Schwartz. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Education and the Faculty Director of the Stanford Accelerator for Learning.
Together, we bring you expert perspectives and conversations to help you stay curious, inspired, and informed. Hi, Dan.
Denise, it's always good to be with you.
How you doing?
Well, I'm good. So here's your question of the day. So it seems to me there are certain things with young children that you'd kind of like to know early because it's going to affect their abilities to learn going down the line. So it seems like glasses, do kids need glasses? But I kind of heard all these stories that nobody discovered this kid needs to sit in the front of the room. Is there a history to them sort of finally saying, gee, we should measure whether kids can see?
Yeah, no, I know a lot of times you don't find out until it's too late. I can tell you, here's a story about my nephew. We didn't know that he was having trouble hearing because, when you're like a baby, you won't know. I don't know. He looked like he was hearing just fine. And then at some point, my brother was like, whoa, I don't think he can hear us when we were saying something, right? And it was like a little bit late. And I know there are things that you want to catch early on because you can do some interventions early on that maybe won't be as effective later. So I think glasses, hearing,
So here's one, reading. So reading's important for everything, to keep learning. And it's kind of a tough space because how do you measure reading before they've had a chance to learn to read?
Oh, total catch-22.
Yeah.
Right?
So we have the guest who's going to answer this.
Magic. I think it's magic. I'm so excited. Magic.
So we're really pleased to have Jason Yeatman back. He's a professor in 3 separate departments at Stanford. He's very Stanford. The Graduate School of Education, the Department of Psychology, and he's in developmental and behavioral pediatrics in the School of Medicine. Jason is very busy. So he, if you remember from the last talk when he was here, I certainly do. He's a neuroscientist, but he is the neuroscientist of behavior, of how people behave. And one of his areas is reading. It's an important area. And he developed a new tool called ROAR, or the Rapid Online Assessment of Reading. And he's going to explain to us how he manages to measure a skill, people acquiring a skill before they've acquired it. So welcome, Jason.
Good to be here.
So is it the case that we used to measure reading at the end of 3rd grade was the first time that we'd actually do some formal assessment of reading?
Yeah, and that's something that's changed a lot. Now, I think 43, it's either 42 or 43 states have universal screening legislation. This is legislation that mandates screening all students for dyslexia. So dyslexia, which is refers to a developmental challenge in learning to read. And this universal screening legislation usually requires screening a couple times a year, starting in kindergarten through grades 1 and 2. And then now getting to this grade 3 you're talking about, that's usually when state testing starts. So the idea is that students are screened for reading difficulties, right away, and for the underlying factors that are going to predict future reading difficulties. This has been a huge legislative achievement in trying to bring more equity to screening.
Wow. Can I ask a tangential question for a second?
Okay.
Only if I'm allowed to give a tangential answer.
If you follow my tangent, yes. So dyslexia is not a thing, right? Dyslexia just means bottom 5% of readers, and then there's different types of dyslexia, or are all dyslexias the same thing?
Yeah, so dyslexia refers to a challenge learning to read. Right? Amongst people with dyslexia, there are a number of different contributing factors. And so when you're thinking about screening, you said this is a tangential question, but it actually wasn't. It's core to your first question.
I think it's totally on topic and very important.
Yay.
Yeah. So when you're thinking about screening for dyslexia, what you're trying to do is tap into these various mechanisms which are developing early on. They're developing before a kid learns to read. So language skills broadly are one factor that contribute to learning to read. Like first, you establish various aspects of spoken language, and then upon that foundation of spoken language, you start layering on written language, right? And that's the job of school, is to start building up written language on top of your spoken language skills. But kids that are struggling for a variety of reasons with spoken language, it's going to be harder learning to read. There's more detailed factors as well. So the most well-known one, the one that's written into pretty much all of these policies across all the states that have universal screening, is measures of phonological awareness. Phonological awareness refers to your ability to hear that speech is composed of constituent sounds. So take the word cat, which is composed of k, at. I can hear those as separate sounds. And if you aren't able to attend to the sound structure of spoken language, then the idea of saying, well, now, Dan, take k, at, and assign a visual symbol to represent each of these sounds, that would just make no sense to you, right? So phonological awareness is one of these foundations where you can really see the clear connection, right? As I explained that, you're like, oh, yeah, of course. If you can't break down speech into its constituent sounds, then how can you learn to represent these sounds with visual symbols?
So, okay, so this is super fascinating. If I have a kid in kindergarten and they don't know how to read yet, you're telling me that you can do some kind of measure that will predict that they're going to have a hard time reading. Am I understanding that right? Is that right?
Yep. Yep, exactly. Yeah, so you can, so phonological awareness, this is one thing you can measure actually, I have a 5-year-old, just turned 5-year-old at home. She doesn't know how to read yet. She's still in preschool, one of the wonderful preschools here on campus. And as someone that studies reading, I'm starting to play these games with her of like, looking at her ability to attend to the sounds in language and looking at informally at these different risk factors that I know are going to predict reading development.
So
But
how what
it's
do you
not
wait,
just
give an
one thing.
example. Like how do you say at? What does that mean? Like what do you give an example of how you do this? Maybe not with your own
Yeah.
5-year-old, but like in real life.
No, I'll be reading her a book and ask her if she can tell which words start with the same sound. She doesn't know all the letters, so it's not looking at the text, but um, I can say, today three people were on a podcast together: Jason, Denise, and Dan. Which of these names starts with the same sound? The answer is Denise and Dan. They both start with a duh.
That's so great. I actually would not have thought about that. So you're really you can this is and if they can't figure that out yet, how do you know they're just not ready to read? How do you know that it's not like a challenge versus they're just not ready? Because like, I had a kid who didn't start reading till he was kind of end of first grade, but he didn't have a
Yeah, so now you're getting into
challenge.
the measurement question, right? So now we're going from and I'm going to restate your question. You're saying, Jason, how do you go from like you and your daughter hanging out and playing games to something that works for a system, right?
Yeah.
A school system where we want to not just assess Jason's kid and Denise's kid, but we want to universally screen all the kids that are entering um, all the California kindergarten classrooms. Um, and that's where you build measures. So within ROAR, Rapid Online Assessment of Reading, we have um, a phonological awareness measure that looks at your ability to hear the first sounds in words, hear the last sounds in words, segment the middle sounds in words. So kind of different aspects of phonological awareness, your ability to attend to rhymes. So there's a kind of a suite of phonological awareness measures, and we've now um, had tens of thousands of kids around California, but all around the country. Now ROAR is used, I think, in either 29 or 30 states. I'll have to look at the website to get the current
So
update.
awesome. Congrats.
Right. So that allows us to collect normative data and make sure that the phenomenon I'm talking about isn't just some unique phenomenon to like the kids that I see around Stanford, but really reflects uh, you know, typical development across the incredible diversity of learners around the United States. And then based on that, we start running studies of predictive validity. So we have scientific hypothesis that this work started in the late 80s, mid-late 80s, like the idea that phonological awareness is a key foundation. So researchers started developing measures to tap into phonological awareness, started running studies to look at how these measures collected before a kid starts school predict their reading into the future. And now we've built on that, and we've built Roar to this whole automated platform, which rather than depending on me as a researcher going and administering measures to each kid, we can have, for example, all the incoming kindergartners in California log in, take our Roar measures, and we can come back a year later and measure the reading skills and look at how these measures predict each other.
So pause there for a second. So the way we used to do it was a 1 hour in-person assessment, and with third graders, with an adult in the room administering it. Now I have a kindergartner in front of a computer, and how do you make sure they're actually looking at the screen and that they're don't drop off out of boredom?
Right, or they're dogging it.
Right. So, well, that's a great challenge. How do you make an assessment that people want to take?
Yeah, that's the challenge. It's this intersection of the part that's fun and fulfilling is this intersection between design and thinking about gameplay and child-centered design. Designing technology for kids is a challenge in its own, right? You have to have something that's engaging, that's fun, that's intuitive. But there's also a science to that too, right? So Roar started off as a pandemic project that was but since then it's grown where each aspect of Roar where for example have a hypothesis about how an aspect of gameplay is gonna improve the fidelity of the data we get by keeping students more engaged. And we can run that now as a randomized controlled trial, an experiment where we randomly give different participants different versions of Roar, and we study how it affects the engagement, how it affects the reliability of the measure. So these are all aspects that.
What's the answer?
Yes.
No, some kids, this is my hypothesis. The kids who have the fun version are gonna stay more engaged than the kids who have the not fun version. Is that a fair hypothesis, Jason?
Yeah, and it turns out to be true. So that actually, I was joking around a little bit, but no, this was actually a serious study we did because as you start gamifying things, you come to decisions about giving people trial by trial feedback, right? And one of the things about gameplay that's engaging is that when things are going well versus not, right? That and that
the player knows.
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
And so you're getting feedback. That's part of what keeps you engaged in a game, which is different than a normal assessment, right? Where Dan, you were talking about delivering in-person assessments, right? And when you're trained on these as a teacher, you're trained to not give any feedback, to just say to reward the fact that they're listening to you, but not to give any indication. And so we ran a study looking at how trial by trial feedback affects performance, and there was different camps of teachers that had worries different ways. So we work with about a half dozen schools that specifically serve children with dyslexia, and in those schools, some of the teachers were worried that getting feedback that they'd gotten answers incorrect could be just emotionally hard for the kids, or that getting feedback that they're getting them correct would allow them to game the system in some way. So this is why it's really important to actually study this rather than just sticking with an old approach of saying, okay, well, there's all these worries that come when you start gamifying things. Let's just not do it, right? That's one way we could, David. We're going into this, it's studying each step, and Denise is correct. Adding in trial by trial feedback increases kids' engagement. They provide more useful data. They stay focused longer, and it doesn't lead to any kind of gaming the system, so to speak.
So I'm glad they haven't gamified the SAT when I took it. Okay. Well, it always seemed my advantage. So I wasn't a great student, but when it came to the test, I could really concentrate.
You're a good test taker.
Yeah, and if they're gamifying it for the other students, suddenly they're going to concentrate as well as I do, and they're going to do a lot better than I did.
Yeah, but with universal screening for learning differences, we're
Fine.
trying. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
No,
I
okay,
do.
but this is a legit question before the break. I'm not a good game player. So how do you separate my bad game playing ability from my not being able to understand phonemic
Tina,
awareness or something?
Denise, if I've got it right, the game component is there something that says "good job."
Is it? Is it, Jason? Okay, so it's not like I have to like have hand-eye coordination
Right,
or
you're not
click on
battling a
something
monster.
faster than the other or
Correct.
follow the
Yeah.
monster through the cave or
The way we think about it is we try to lightly gamify them. So they're tests, and we want kids to take them seriously, right? So that's part of the art that goes with the science, right? It's like we're not trying to immerse people in a 3D world where they're battling monsters and don't realize they're like
see you.
kids know that they're taking an assessment and that they're asked to take it seriously, like they take an assessment like they would another assessment. Now you could say actually a lot of kids don't take assessment seriously, and that always is a challenge. And that was Dan's original question, right? Is like, yes, there are going to be some portion of students where you don't know if their low score was because they really were struggling with it or because they weren't putting in their full effort, and that's an issue whether it's delivered one-on-one or through a platform. And it turns out like you engage different kids different ways. So I'm not a in many ways, I spend a lot of time developing technology, but I also think technology should be there to support the teacher. Technology should be there to support the teacher, and I think assessment is this perfect place, right? You think about, Dan, if you're running a school district and you have a limited amount of time for professional development with your teachers, um, I would prefer that you spend that time working on strategies to intervene and improve kids' reading skills, as opposed to hammering away on how do you deliver this assessment in compliance with the technical manual. And that's where technology can lift up teachers, right? Like through this automated approach where we can study the different aspects, gamify, get a standardized measure. It allows teachers to spend more time doing what teachers want to do, which is teaching.
So, Denise, when I taught English or language skills, I often thought kids who weren't doing well, the problem was motivation.
What grade are you teaching?
Seventh, eighth.
Seventh, eighth grade. Okay.
Yeah, and I've decided that the problem's motivation. So I do a lot of work to try and create the reading activities be more meaningful, more interesting. But I had no way to know that kids were like having trouble sounding out letters. I never had kids like read aloud in class. I didn't like to do that. Did you have this kind of problem when you taught?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you should have kids read aloud in class in some sense because exactly for that reason, right? I know, well, I'll tell you here, this is how my husband was taught history. I'm not making this up, okay? You would come in and you would start with the first person at the front of the row and you would read the first paragraph of the history book, and then the second person would read the second paragraph and the third person would read the third paragraph, and he would count ahead to know what paragraph that he was going to read to see if there were any big words or hard words or whatever and get kind of practice. And if anyone was out of line or whatever, he was totally, totally toast, right? He'd practice the wrong paragraph. And if you got lost or you didn't know where you were, you had to stand up. You had to stand up for the rest of the class. So it was very much this very scary. Imagine if you had dyslexia.
You had to stand up for the rest of the class. What theory is that?
This is punishment for not paying attention because same thing. The teacher did not understand that it was a reading struggle or you didn't want to read out loud or maybe you were embarrassed by an accent or whatever, right? The teacher was just pissed that you messed up the system and you weren't paying attention.
Wow.
I know.
Sorry, just the idea that you would have someone stand up so that they're both physically and socially uncomfortable.
Yeah. Talk about a total degradation ceremony, right?
Boy, that's rough.
But I agree with you. I would never have students read out loud. And I will tell you this, sometimes it's a play like Romeo and Juliet, where it is actually kind of important to have someone read out loud or to hear it read out loud. And you have to be careful because you don't know what's going on with those kids. You don't know who's going to be comfortable and not comfortable and stumble over words or whatnot. You really don't want to shame kids, particularly when it comes to anything in the classroom, but reading especially. But yeah, I would have no idea. I would think it was motivation too, right? It's if you have no idea, and by the way, we weren't trained to assess reading skills. Were you? I wasn't.
No.
Never.
No.
Never.
So, Jason, something I've seen about computerized assessments is they can be a lot more precise than teachers' ability to develop instructional interventions, right? And so isn't there a model where the computer does the assessment and then does the treatment as well, and the teacher's out of the loop?
You know, I think humans learn best from other humans. There's social learning is hugely important, and I think we often think about the goal of school of just filling the brain with more things. And it's important, you know, at some level, if you were to tell me that my kid was going to go to a classroom where the teacher was not going to have the ability to teach them, would I want technology to step in? Most certainly, yes. But I'd much rather be in a classroom that's resourced with a teacher that's supported to support the students' needs holistically more than just filling them with more letters.
So there's that second grade teacher you never really liked, Jason. On the other hand, there's a computer that has Luke Skywalker praising you for getting all the right answers.
No, that's the assessment. That's not the. Or you're saying make that
No,
the
no,
intervention too?
the question is right.
I think it has a place, Dan. I think it has a place. I get the question. I think it has a place, but I think I'm still sticking with like that. We want to empower teachers, empower compassionate, caring humans to be the lead here, and technology can be a great supplemental resource, right? And I think we often um, ask the question in the wrong way. We're often asking like oh, can AI do this or can technology do this? But we should be asking, do we want technology to do this? Do we want AI to step in here? And I think often the answer, like I don't know, when you think about your kids, would you want do you want them just learning exclusively from the computer? No, you want it to be a supplement where for the individualized parts of it, sure, that there's an engaging teacher that's working with students on their skills. Practice is a great thing to do through an app, right? If you're just needing more practice to master a skill. A teacher can't spend that much individual one-on-one time. Tutoring is a great option, but if financial resources preclude tutoring, great place for technology to support learning, but not to be the place where all the learning is done.
I
Okay.
agree 100%. I love having this conversation with Dan in the room, Jason. Just come with me every time I have this conversation with Dan. I love
Hey,
it.
just to be clear, I think teachers are really important. My point was simpler, which is our diagnoses may be more precise than the available actions to the teacher.
Yeah, that is a good question, and what we think about with Roar. So Roar has gone from a research tool to a tool working at the scale of systems. And what we like to think about with school districts is how to build an effective multi-tiered system of support. Right. So that's the goal here, right? Is that you're catching problems early and you're finding students that just need a little bit more help. And then as those students, some of those students that just need a little more help are getting the help they need and they're fine. And others continually need to be brought to like a more intensive, directed, sometimes one-on-one, and this is where there is this interplay where technology can thoughtfully fill a lot of these gaps, but it's not the solution on its own, right? It should be integrated with like a thoughtful, multi-tiered system of support.
So, okay, building on what you just said, I still want to know how you can tell the difference between a kid who's just having a little bit of a slower roll to learn how to read, may need a little bit of one-on-one, versus someone who is going to be diagnosed, have an IEP, which is going to get them special support. How do can you tell that in kindergarten, or is that something you have to give to older students?
No, that's something you look at over time, right? So back to this idea of a multi-tiered system of supports. Your first, everyone should have high quality basic instruction. And you should screen kids, and some kids are going to be struggling, and those need a little additional support. Um, and then there are those that are going to keep struggling on the screener, struggling on all the assessments, and yeah, those are the ones that are going to need a different level of support. Is it important to have a diagnosis? That's really a policy question, not a science question. Because what I would say is, assessments provide data on who needs support and what. If you have a system that's resourced to provide students the support in the areas they need, the diagnosis itself is not important. However, for a policy standpoint, the diagnosis gives you access sometimes in certain scenarios, gives you access to services you wouldn't otherwise have.
So would it be okay, this is the I don't know if you want to answer this. Should we not be labeling people with dyslexia? Should we just say, here's a bunch of people who need extra support, let's give them extra support?
That it's like a policy and economics question, not a science of reading question in my mind, right? The label is a way to be granted additional services, but the label on its own doesn't do anything useful. It explains something to the parent. Actually, there's many parents for whom the diagnosis is the sigh of relief of like, oh, this is the struggles we've been having. So I don't want to discount that. But if you imagine like the perfectly tuned multi-tiered system of support where you're moving kids through the different levels, the to me the diagnosis isn't critical there unless you decide as the person implementing the system that one of these levels requires a diagnosis to get it. But that being said, a diagnosis acknowledges a struggle that someone is having, right? So you think about the older readers. This is often true that kids don't get a diagnosis until sixth or seventh grade, and those students have been it's school is often traumatic for them. They've been going through years of school not being able to do a thing that's like fundamental in the classroom. Being asked to read out loud in a public setting and knowing they're not going to be able to do that, right? Every day at school can be a challenge for a kid that really has struggles with dyslexia. So for that kid, the diagnosis can be a source of power, and in that case, it's important.
Yeah, no, if you're a parent and you've got a kid coming home and refusing to do their homework, a part of you might think they're being lazy or they're being ornery or they're being defiant when really they're refusing it because it's just a degradation ceremony every single time they try to open a book they can't read. Having that diagnosis is a lifesaver.
So let me switch a little bit. So I taught English in middle school, and I don't remember ever giving a straight up reading assessment. Do
Yeah,
do is it like
it's a great question.
I taught it in high school and I never gave it, ever.
Let me give you now the two areas you guys just asked about, the two areas that I'm most excited about with Roar, and it is upper elementary school into middle school and high school. Let's take this Dan teaching middle school, and there's probably a bunch of students come into your class. You probably don't have a lot of information about them, about their foundational skills, and you just have students that are struggling across everything. I would be willing to bet that you take that section of your class that's just struggling with everything. Half, third, half of those students, the issue is really that they never mastered foundational reading skills. They're still stumbling through decoding words. They're still struggling to read fluently enough to, read large passages, to digest information, to read the instructions on a math test. And this is what we find. This is through research partnerships with many dozens of middle schools and high schools. We're finding that of the students that are not meeting standards on the state tests, a huge portion of those are also struggling with the foundations of reading. Now, I find this both sad and concerning, but also a place of hope because it's actionable. We know how to teach reading. When we think about, how do we teach, the middle school student that, is not meeting, many of the standards. How do we teach all these standards? That's a very complex problem. But how do we teach them to decode words and read fluently? There's an extensive literature on how to do that. The challenge, though, for you, Dan, as the English teacher, like it's not really within the structure of your day, right? So this requires a thinking about structuring middle school differently if we're going to start addressing these challenges. Early screening legislation, the ideal is that these challenges all get addressed early, and this fact that I'm telling you is no longer a fact. But in the real world we live in, um, I think that there's a lot of power to thinking about addressing reading challenges at whatever age they are.
I think it's awesome that Roar works not just for the young kids then, right? Like this, you can use it with an 8th grader, you can use it with a 10th grader, you can use it with an adult.
If it has Star Wars characters, yeah.
You don't have a version for
Dan, I'm
adults
bringing
yet.
you in to help with the next gamified version. We just got a volunteer to help with this.
Yeah. So so it's not ready for adults yet, because I just know, like, the population in prisons and whatever, a lot of people I've heard in the adult correctional institutions are struggling readers as well. I mean, this is a problem that goes well beyond.
It's a huge problem, and this is why we've decided to keep Roar at Stanford and run it through a research practice partnership model as opposed to spinning off a company, because there's so many interesting is the wrong word. There's so many important research questions and also ways to serve underserved populations of society. You brought up one of prison populations, like that. That's an area where assessments are not common, but as they do make it there, like, they could play a really important role. Um, the other thing we're working on now, hopefully when this podcast goes live, it'll be right around the time of our launch of Roar at Home, our parent portal. Our goal is to democratize access to high quality data to any parent that wants to learn more information about their kids' reading skills, their kids' math skills. We have math assessments in Roar as well. We also, back to the example you gave at the beginning, are building a suite of vision assessments. There's a lot of aspects of way your visual system processes information that we can also measure through tasks we've developed. And this will give parents access to score reports in real time. It'll also allow parents and families to contribute to and participate in research.
Okay, I love that there's this idea of Roar at Home, and there's a part of me that's a little bit afraid because, we have some really hyper uber.
I can solve it. I can solve it,
Wait,
Denise.
but I didn't even say the problem yet.
It's so. The answer is, Jason, they're not allowed to use the assessment on their kid more than once every 2 months.
Okay, right?
Did I get it right, Denise?
Yeah, there's someone who's going to be like, do you read yet? Do you read yet? Let's do it again. Wait, oh my gosh, now I need, all these interventions. We're going to we're going to workbook you to death. We're going to flashcard you to death. That's my fear.
I think that we are neither going to prevent nor cause that.
That's like policy. You're going to push that off to policy and economics and all that. Someone else is going to solve that problem.
If a parent wants to test their kid 1,000 times and buy every single intervention program, whether or not I'm involved, but no, I mean, to Dan's point, it's like, we can set up guardrails here, and one of our goals is, to provide high quality information, right? And we provide instructional recommendations. We don't provide recommendations for a specific curriculum or a specific product to buy. We provide information on, like, approaches to work with students that have different kinds of challenges. So, our hope is really to curate the scientific literature. We're always hoping to do better on this. We're a small team. Unfortunately, we don't have enough people to do as comprehensive a job as we'd like. But that's the goal, right? Is to curate the scientific literature in a way that a parent could digest and learn about their child's strengths and weaknesses, not test them every week, maybe test them a couple times a year, quarterly. Quarterly is pretty good. You can see growth curves then. You can chart growth over time. Monthly would be okay too.
No, oh, no. There's so many other things little kids need to be doing than sitting and testing. But I love the availability of this for people at home, for schools that aren't, using it yet or whatever. We want early intervention for sure.
It's not a test, Denise. It's a game.
It's a game. It's a game.
It's
yes,
a game.
And they'll have fun doing it. But I just worry about flashcards instead of go outside and play. Right? We need a balance. This is where challenge success can come in. We'll partner with you.
I'm a big
Jason.
fan of outside and play. There we go.
Yeah. There we go. Jason, thank you so much for being here. Some final words. Dan Schwartz, looked like you were going to say something. Final words here.
So summarizing, I think this is an amazing demonstration of what science and smart design can do.
Yeah.
Right? Where you really take what we know about the world and render it in a form that's just so helpful, so useful. It's not guessing all over the place, and it's very precise. I think this is a testimony to what educational research can do.
Thank you, Jason, for being here. And thank all of you for joining this episode of Schools In. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune in. I'm Denise Pope.
And I'm Dan.
Nice job, Dan.
Thank you.